Hello everybody, my name is Tom Froese. I'm based at the Center for Complexity Sciences in Mexico City. Joel kindly invited me to take part in your symposium, but due to the distance, unfortunately I can't be there in person, but hopefully this video presentation will be good enough. The title of my talk today is An Enactive Critique of the Psychopathologies of Cognitive Science. Let us begin with some conceptual work. What is a theory of mind? It has been long standard procedure in cognitive science to explain most, and I would say pretty much all, social understanding in terms of underlying theory of mind mechanisms. And although it's supposed to be an explanation of social understanding, we also find that in the literature many people use the term to refer to social understanding as such, thereby confusing that which we want to explain by the kind of mechanism we use to explain it. And in any case, the way that people try to explain social understanding is primarily in terms of mentalizing and mind reading. And this kind of mind is usually cashed out in three different attributes. Mind reading is the combined ability to attribute mental states to the hidden minds of others, to explain the behavior of others in terms of the hidden mental states that have been attributed in step 1, and to predict their future behavior according to the explanation that has been formulated. And so this is exactly the kind of definition that I will refer to as theory of mind in this talk. And I just want to make it that whenever I say theory of mind or mind reading, I mean exactly these three attributes, these three abilities. And I don't mean to refer to social understanding as such. Obviously, social understanding as such, as a phenomenon to be explained, exists. That's not the question. The question is, how do we want to explain this ability, and what does this ability consist in? Usually it's thought that mind reading, in the way we just defined it, is the kind of common sense or folk psychological way of understanding how we understand other people, and that it is a defining feature of our social lives. So, for example, Nichols says, folk psychological prediction and explanation abound in our lives. We engage in it for mundane course, like trying to figure out what the baby wants, what your peers believe about your work, and what your spouse will do if you arrive home late. So certainly the case that we can engage in mental interference and prediction and explanation of other minds if the situation happens to demand such an explicit evaluation from us. So if we're in the car driving home late, we might well think about what our wife will do when we arrive at the house. But is this kind of detached, non-interactive, reflective kind of social cognition the most pervasive element of our social lives? It seems that this is what the mainstream in cognitive science holds. It seems to say that the primary and default way of how we understand others is mind reading, even during situations of real-time face-to-face interaction, and even when we are not aware of this mind reading. So just to give one example, according to Carruthers, human beings are inveterate mind readers. We routinely and for the part unconsciously represent the mental states of the people around us, thus employing meta-representations, representations of representational states. We attribute to them perceptions, feeling, goals, intention, knowledge, and beliefs, and we form our expectations accordingly. There has been much written about a subtle difference within this theory of mind or mind-reading literature, and that has to do with whether the emphasis of the mechanism is placed on evidence-based theorizing, known as theory, or imaginative simulating, known as simulation theory. Okay, while the theory depicts social understanding as a thoroughly detached theoretical activity, simulation theory tries to incorporate some mimicking or impersonation of the mental life of others. Nevertheless, I would say that for the purposes of this talk, this difference in emphasis is negligible, because if you look at the way that Galise and Goldman, for example, put forward their idea of simulation theory, the basic idea for them is that attributors use their own mental mechanism to calculate and to predict the mental processes of others. So here we have three aspects of mind reading that I highlighted earlier. So, according to this mainstream view, social understanding is not based on our direct perceptual experience of others as persons and our immediate embodied interaction with them. Rather, social understanding depends on our cognitively attributing internal mental representations to opaque and perceptually inaccessible physical bodies. And this is a view of social cognition is nicely characterized by Heel. She says, "We are set to view other people as we view stars, clouds, or geological formations. People are just complex objects in our environment whose behavior we wish to anticipate, but whose causal innards we perceive. We therefore proceed by observing the intricacies of their external behavior and formulating some hypothesis about how their insides are structured." So this is the mind of the other as a black box. And surely sometimes we face situations where we cannot make sense of the other, and in that case we might theorize about them, or we might imagine what it would be like to be in their place. This is uncontroversial, but the problem is that this kind of ability is being generalized to all social understanding. So we have Goldman saying, for example, that simulation is the primitive root form of interpersonal mentalization, and Carruthers, as we said, holds that human beings are inveterate mind readers. Now, Gallagher has made a useful assessment of this theoretical stance, and he has come up with 4 items that he thinks are definitory of the theory of mind approach. We begin with the idea of the hidden mind. The idea is that we cannot directly perceive other people's beliefs, desires, and feelings, and so forth, and it's because of this opacity that we need some extra perceptual cognitive processes, mind reading, that will allow us to infer what it is that we're missing from our perception. Accordingly, because we have no other way of accessing other minds, mind reading must be pervasive. And third, this requires an observational stance. So rather than being in face-to-face, real-time, immediate interaction, we are somehow apart, somehow outside of the situation, observing what is happening and making explanations and predictions. And these explanations and predictions are done by an individual. This is the idea of methodological individualism. It doesn't matter that there's another person in front of us or not. It doesn't matter whether we are watching a video of social interaction in a brain scanner or whether we are immediately engaged in a social interaction. The explanation of social ability is limited to one individual, or in most cases, just their brain. Now, this kind of view has been criticized for a long time by the phenomenological tradition. For example, Shaler famously remarked that it may appear self-evident for intellectualist theories to assume that we perceive nothing of another person apart from their physical body and its meaningless movements, but it just requires some simple phenomenological consideration to show that there is in fact nothing about this. He says, "For we certainly believe ourselves to be directly acquainted with another person's joy in his laughter, with his sorrow and pain in his tears, with his shame in his blushing, with his entreaty in his outstretched hands, with his love in his look of affection. If anyone tells me that this is not perception, for it cannot be so in view of the fact that their perception is simply a complex of physical sensations, I would beg him to turn aside from such questionable theories and address himself to the phenomenological facts." More recent work in phenomenology has continued this kind of critique, and a strong point of emphasis is usually that social understanding is something that happens in interaction. So Radcliffe has made a nice analysis of what happens when we meet someone for a conversation, and he says that the flow of conversation is not simply facilitated by two discrete thinkers interpreting each other by ascribing internal mental states. No, my ability to interpret you is actually constituted by your interactions with me. You are a part of the interpretive process. Of course, there is some scope for disagreement. But I would say that enactive cognitive science and phenomenology challenged all 4 mainstream positions that have been identified by Gallagher. Instead, we would say that we normally primarily make sense of others by means of direct perception and embodied interaction, just as we've seen written by Shaler and Radcliffe. This is not to say that we experience our own minds in the same way that we experience other minds, or that all minds are equally transparent under all conditions. But the important point is that we do not perceive the bodily presence of another person merely as a mechanical object, as if seeing a mindless zombie. So it turns out that under the onslaught of this phenomenological critique, a lot of people in the social cognition literature have started to accept the phenomenological critique and thereby agree that the phenomenology of our everyday experience of social interaction or social cognition actually supports the phenomenological theory. That is, we do not see mindless mechanisms in front of us. We see other living people with minds and everything. And a lot of the gestures are very expressive in their own right. We don't engage in explicit mind reading in a lot of the time. But, and this is the new move that comes from this literature, there is this idea that this is completely irrelevant to cognitive science. The idea is that what theory of mind is really talking about are the subpersonal mechanisms of social understanding. So as for example Spalding here says, with mind reading there's a process, theorizing and simulating, and there's a product, an explanation or a prediction, and in general neither the process nor the product need to be consciously accessible, let alone phenomenologically transparent. So this is a very drastic move, because phenomenology cannot be so easily avoided in cognitive science, even in the case of theory of mind approaches, because much of what is intuitive about the theory of mind approach and mind reading will be lost if their psychological discourse is no longer allowed to have any connection with the personal level of conscious experience. In other words, we are no longer talking about folk psychology. So in both cases, in the traditional view and in the enactive view, I think a more productive is to determine what constraints obtain between the phenomenology of social understanding and the cognitive science of subpersonal processes, so to evaluate which of the relationships are the most viable ones. And so here we come to the idea of something like social neurophenomenology. We want to focus the research on conscious experience of and the unconscious process and link them together in order to gain a better understanding. Okay, so now returning to psychopathology. What is the relevance of this debate in social cognition to our understanding of psychopathology, and what does psychopathology can bring to the debate in about social cognition? So first of all, it's true that psychological tests designed to evaluate mind reading capabilities pose significant problems for people with schizophrenia and autism. However, what has not been sufficiently problematized so far is whether these impaired mind reading abilities are the primary cause of impaired social understanding, or rather a secondary effect of a more basic social impairment. Obviously, the mainstream has to focus on the former hypothesis. But an alternative possibility is that mind reading is primarily derived from embodied social interaction, and that this is the embodied foundation, and this embodied foundation is what is impaired in schizophrenia and autism, such that the impaired mind reading capacities are actually a secondary consequence of a more basic disruption. So let's take a closer look at the phenomenology, the psychopathology of schizophrenia to evaluate these two hypotheses. On the one hand, or what should we emphasize straight from the start, is that persons with schizophrenia often experience the behavior of others as opaque and utterly incomprehensible, no matter how mundane the situation would appear to a healthy individual. And for phenomenologists, this is sometimes termed the loss of vital contact with reality, and is usually taken as a lack of effective cognitive attunement. If we look at the first-person descriptions of people with schizophrenia, we find reports as follows. I cannot associate with other persons. I do not feel steady. It is as if my matter was separating from the world. I cannot connect with the other persons. When I am with others, I cannot express myself. I don't lack words. I lack something else, a piece of the situation. All right, so there's a lack of extension into the world and a throwback onto the individual here. Moreover, we find an emphasis on the observational stance. One of the most striking characteristics of schizophrenia is the pervasive lack of natural self-evidence and the necessity of observing and explaining everything in an attempt to gain some understanding. So another report: it is not enough for me to take things as the others do. They are happy with that. I need endless explanations of all that happens. Why does that happen? Why does that mean? How to explain it? And it turns out that this pervasive necessity of observing and explaining is particularly acute in the case of social interaction. Indeed, persons with schizophrenia can be said to be forced to engage in mind reading as the principal mode of social understanding, and they have to do so consciously for the most part. For example, when a child, I used to watch my little cousins in order to understand when it was the right moment to laugh, or how they managed to act without thinking of it before. It is since I was a child that I tried to understand how the others function, and I am therefore forced to play the little anthropologist. Thus, for people with schizophrenia, social interaction is not something that spontaneously unfolds in real time, but it requires observing, analyzing, and predicting actions. So here we have a case of mind reading, and in precisely the sense in which it has been traditionally defined by cognitive science. You might find many examples of this. Here's a table of different reports by people which have been categorized by Stangalini and Ballerini as an algorithmic conception of sociality. So this is something that characteristic of schizophrenia. There's also a lack of direct social perception in schizophrenia. And this is exactly what necessitates the patient to behave like a cognitive scientist who observes, theorizes about, and predicts the actions of others. However, unfortunately, this mind reading cannot compensate the loss of direct social perception and intersubjective attunement. Indeed, in severe cases, the presence of a familiar person is reduced to the uncanny experience as a physical body, an it. And this is a passage taken from a book by a patient called Renée. She says, "Though I certainly recognized her, she became part of the unreal world. I knew her name and everything about her, yet she appeared strange, unreal like a statue. I saw her eyes, her nose, her lips moving, heard her voice, and understood what she said perfectly. Yet I was in the presence of a stranger. She seems more a statue than ever, a mannequin moved by a mechanism. Talking like an automaton. It is horrible, inhuman, grotesque." Now, I find this kind of description very interesting because it shows us that the basic assumption of much of theory of mind and social cognition literature, namely that we are present in perception with nothing but physical bodies, which then we have to reason about or simulate something about and attribute about, it's just not the case. It does exist this kind of experience of opaque other minds, of hidden minds, but it is the marker of a very severe psychopathology. Also important to note here is that this failure of social understanding is not due to a failure of the intellect. This is important because, of course, a theory of mind proponent might say, oh, the reason why the mechanisms of theory of mind do not work in the case of a schizophrenic patient is because they don't have the capacity to reason properly. They don't have the intellectual capacity to employ the mechanisms in the right kind of way. But this doesn't seem to be the case. In many cases, the intellect is not affected. And indeed, many schizophrenic persons reflect at length about their social situation. But the problem is that such knowledge does not replace immediate experience. For example, in the words of an 18-year-old patient, "I am more and more losing contact with my environment. What remains is only an abstract knowledge of what goes on around me." So, this compensatory strategy, which relies on a kind of cognitivist approach of gathering propositional content and general rules about situations, doesn't compensate sufficiently for the lack of a more attunement with the world. And revealingly, as another schizophrenic patient describes it, "I am not involved in the world, merely observing it from the outside to understand its secret workings." Another interesting characteristic of schizophrenia is the presence of an impairment of their body. And this is expressed in different ways. One example is that the patient loses immediate contact with their own body and is thereby forced to reflectively observe and control its movement. And this is a passage comes from an interview. The patient says, "In general, I didn't have a sense of my body anymore. This completely vanished at some time. And there were periods in which I felt extremely badly coordinated, when I just made a movement with the arm, and the arm had moved further than I wanted it to move. But I also found myself to be extremely clumsy, somehow, when walking. I therefore constantly observed my walking and my movements. Climbing the stairs was also very extreme, when you need a bit of concentration and a feeling of balance. I really thought each step after the other, as it were, each movement." And this kind of disembodiment is very akin to the traditional style of creating robots, by the way, where we have a cycle of sensing, of modeling, of calculating and predicting the movements of joints and limbs, and doing that constantly for each movement throughout. And in this case, it is done by a person, of course, unfortunately. But it shows that the kind of way that traditional cognitive science thinks about embodiment and movement is reflected here in this psychopathology. And another interesting thing is that this kind of problem is not limited just to schizophrenia. We can find similar features in autism spectrum disorders. So, for example, people with autism spectrum disorders, or ASD, curiously do not spontaneously make empathic and expressive gestures. And similarly, also, their process of social cognition resembles the detached sense model plan-act architecture of Goffard, which I just mentioned. In one example, one patient says, "I sit down after an exchange to figure out intentions, belief, etc. I definitely need to do this offline, after the fact, not in real time." So again, people with autism spectrum disorder are also forced to use mind reading as a means of reflective compensation for an impairment of immediate embodied social understanding. And this reflective compensation can become an obsession for them, similar to people with schizophrenia. Here we have an example where the person says, "Given that thinking in a right way is important to me, I need much time to read how the others lived, how the others did." So there's this need to gather lots of information about social interaction, or to use that in a way that allows better predictions about others' mental states and behaviors. Um, Accordingly, people with ASD tend to be both hyper-systemizers and hypo-empathizers. And here again, we have the two sides of the same coin. If there is no empathizing, no possibility of direct intuitive understanding of other minds, well, then the only alternative is to create systems of knowledge which somehow are supposed to substitute or replace the lack of direct understanding. So people with ASD are driven to create knowledge systems that make the environment and people easier to explain and to predict, such as task lists, routines, or schedules. So we could think about these kinds of strategies as ways for supporting through tools mind reading in the way that we defined it at the beginning of the talk. So, and this is now we come to what for me is the most fascinating part. It seems that the first-person experience of people suffering from schizophrenia and high-functioning ASD show that their social understanding closely matches the four main aspects of theory of mind that we mentioned earlier. So, on one hand, these persons are confronted with the problem of hidden minds, such that the behavior of others appears opaque and unintelligible to them, and others may not even be perceived as persons anymore. Second, for these persons, mind reading is the primary, pervasive, and default way of understanding others. Third, they also habitually adopt an observational stance, In social interaction, they continually observe the behaviors of others and make elaborate theories about them in order to better explain and predict their actions. And they also do this offline, of course. 4. The typical means of gaining social standing is characterized by methodological individualism. In other words, their way of understanding others primarily depends on their own cognitive abilities and not so much on what the other person is bringing to the situation. So we have a couple of matches and mismatches here. On the one hand, the disturbed experience of social understanding in persons with schizophrenia and high-functioning ASD strengthens the phenomenological critique of theory of approaches. In accordance with the phenomenology of normal social experience, phenomenological psychopathology further highlights that being an inveterate mind reader badly matches our normal conscious situation. So here we have the further support of the phenomenological critique of social cognition. But we can now go further than this, because on the contrary, being an inveterate mind reader is a diagnostic marker of severe mental disorders, such that the mainstream presuppositions of the cognitive science of normal unconscious processing is a surprisingly good match for the phenomenology of abnormal conscious experience. It is therefore incumbent on theory of mind approaches to explain why being an inveterate mind reader, as the default social stance, should not be considered as insufficient to compensate lack of embodied skills as well, just as it is the case in psychopathology. Why is it? Why would they be capable of normal social understanding rather than suffer from the same kind of problems faced by persons with schizophrenia or ASD? Why should an inveterate mind reader who we know failed at the personal level not be transferred to the homunculus in their brain? That is to say, in the case of schizophrenia, for example, where we have a very pronounced emphasis of mind reading and a lack of embodied social interaction, we find that mind reading is not sufficient to compensate for the lack of embodied social interaction, and these people have great problems dealing in social situations. So now, if you take these mechanisms of mind reading and project them into some sort of homunculus inside the brain, then why should that homunculus not face the same problems, since it's also going to be isolated, disembodied, and all these kind of other things? And so it is no longer possible to simply generalize assumed psychological personal level narratives to the subpersonal level of unconscious processing without considering the implications of mental disorders. And I would also like to highlight that there is the enactive alternative. So we have noted that the social interactional dysfunction and a form of disembodiment are characteristic features of the phenomenology of schizophrenic and ASD disturbance. And conversely, this gives further support to the idea that such embodied processes play an integral role in situations of normal social understanding. It is therefore worth taking seriously the alternative proposal offered by the enactive approach to cognitive science, which conceives of the social in terms of interaction dynamics spanning across neural, bodily, and environmental, including others' bodily, factors. Then there is also the question of why is it that mainstream cognitive science has been proposing a pathological theory. You may wonder why it is that cognitive science traditionally portrayed the nature of normal social understanding in a way that, at least from the perspective of phenomenological psychopathology, appears to be patently anomalous. This is a topic that goes way beyond what I can say here. I just want to make two indications that might help us to understand a little bit why the situation is this way. On the one hand, scientists are often trained to adopt an objective stance when studying other people, and so rather than empathizing with their participants in social interaction and attunement, they detach themselves and objectify the participants, because this is normally what people say is a requirement for objective results. Also, participants are typically placed in rather unusual experimental situations in which their normal smooth coping strategies are less likely to succeed. And in those kind of situations, it's quite to be expected that more reflective and less situated strategies will become more pronounced. So it's therefore not surprising why in traditional cognitive science there has been such an emphasis on detached observation and analysis. both the scientists and their participants engage in such strategies in order to resolve the experimental situations. But whereas this is a matter of choice for the scientists and their participants, it is unfortunately a matter of necessity for people who are suffering from severe impairment of social understanding. So, on my view, this careless generalization belonging to the lab context leads to an impoverished conception of the normal human condition and its impairments. And so therefore, I think one of the main conclusions of this is that no matter how the current debate about mind reading will be settled in the end, a general lesson from this dilemma is that cognitive science needs to pay more attention to human experience, both normal and abnormal. And so that with this, I come to the end of my 30 minutes. For those of you who are interested to follow up the references and the arguments of this talk, the primary reference is the one at the top of this page, which was co-authored with Stangelini, an expert in schizophrenia, and Bertelli, an expert in autism. And I'll highlight two other references which continue this theme of looking at the way a phonological approach to perception affects cognitive science. I think the first one will be of interest to many. In this case, we managed to show that embodied social interaction actually changes people's experience and can relate to a phenomenology of clear social awareness. And the second one is an analysis of the literature of comparative psychology, in which we showed that the mainstream assumption of comparative psychology says pretty much the same thing as the mainstream social cognition I've criticized here, namely that animals perceive animals primarily as physical objects like any other, and any additional understanding of their behavior comes through attribution of mental states, reasoning about mental states, and so forth. And we show in this paper that if we assume the alternative, namely that most of the time animals understand each other intuitively, perceptually, and that abstract reasoning about other mental states is actually a very advanced, perhaps almost uniquely human ability, the comparative psychology of imitation becomes much more understandable, actually. So both of these build on the ideas that I've been discussing in this talk. And with this, I thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you.